When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
And we're live on match day as Doug reaches for a buffalo wing. He's got it! Oh, and he's gone for a can of Pepsi too! What a finish! There's no doubt about it. It just tastes better. Match days deserve Pepsi.
This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Rebecca Larson and I am so happy to welcome back again Dr. Lacey Bonar Hull. Welcome.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
I had to have you back because we didn't quite finish last time and people are just clamoring for more information on these medieval women's networking groups.
I love that. Hey, I'm here to provide it. I will provide any and all information on these women.
Yeah. This is one of the things that I appreciate about you so much is the fact that you focus a lot on medieval women. Mm-hmm. And as we all know, they are the ones who are probably the least talked about just because the sources really didn't cover them very much, did they?
Yeah, definitely. And that's especially the case when it, comes to the Wars of the Roses time period, because I feel like there's so much interest there, understandably so, in the different battles and political movements and alliance shifting and honestly just kind of downright backstabbing of a lot of the men who were involved. And their movements are much more detailed in the primary sources that we have still surviving today. But what I find really fascinating and what we talked about in part one is, the ability of these women to really use their own friendship networks, family networks, to also operate politically during this really dangerous time period. The hard thing is that we only get glimpses into their political maneuverings because it just wasn't recorded as often in the sources that we have surviving to us today. So, the chronicles, the governmental sources, the records of who, was fighting in different battles, we get some good insight into these men who were similarly operating at a really interesting time period in history. But the women's involvement, we can almost pin it down, but often we're just so limited in source survival that I said in part one of our discussion, it's kind of like a puzzle. Like you have to find these different puzzle pieces and you have to fit them together to try and get an idea of a fuller picture of how these women were operating, which is something I find really exciting and interesting. And, I love the work I do studying these different women, but you do find yourself wishing that more sources survived, focusing on these women in particular, because it is a bit of a challenge to uncover their stories, but it's so rewarding. It's such rewarding work, to kind of shine a spotlight on some really incredible individuals who, for a long time, their contributions have been, at worst ignored, at best not covered to their fullest extent, really, until recent generations of historians started looking into these women and their contributions.
Just makes me realize how future historians, say a century from now, how lucky they will be to look back at our present day or even the last 50 years of our lifetime with all of the source records available on women. Like it's just so different, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, there's the leaps and bounds that have been made, especially in studies of medieval women, really, like you're saying, over the past 50 or 60 years. It's really incredible, the work that has been done. And it has just opened so many doors. And, it's allowed so many generations of historians in the time since to find, a particular woman or a particular group of women even to focus on as individuals. And that's something that we just did not have. There were a couple women covered by the Victorians who we had some decent insight into their lives. But even then, it might not, their lives might not have been reported on as accurately as they have been in more recent generations as, more primary sources have become available to us. And we're still finding things in the archives even today that illuminate the lives of these medieval women. And I say all the time, it's an exciting time to be a medievalist, and it's a really exciting time to be interested in women's history and uncovering these stories, because we are very well equipped now to do this work. And it's fun to think what all we can uncover in the next 10, 20, or 30 years as more people are studying these really incredible women who we know were also movers and shakers in medieval society. It's just that their stories have often been kind of veiled, a little bit,
Good word.
just because of source survival and also just source access for historians.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited because today we're going to be looking at Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. But before we get into them, I'd love it if you just do a quick recap of the last episode, because in that one we looked at Jaquetta of Luxembourg, Margaret of Anjou, and Cecily Neville. But we really looked at those ladies, didn't we? I'm so
Yes.
excited. So if you could just do a quick recap of what we
Yeah.
kind of covered.
Yep. So part one, we looked at that earlier generation of the women who were living and surviving through the Wars of the Roses, which was not a guarantee. And, that's something that we talked about a little bit last time, that is important to keep in mind. I think anytime we're talking about the Wars of the Roses, and especially when we're talking about these women, is that we know how it ended, right? We know what ended up happening with the Tudors coming to the throne. But at the time period, people did not know what was happening, and they were really doing the best with the limited information that they had. And that's something that we see happening a lot with Cecily Neville, Margaret of Anjou, and Jaquetta of Luxembourg. When, there were rumblings happening at the court, there was discontent with Henry VI. Richard, Duke of York, was kind of waiting in the wings as being a very capable, maybe not replacement for the king, because I don't think he had his eyes set on the crown until he had to, but at least as someone who would be a good and responsible advisor for the king, someone who had kind of been pushed out of positions of power, but he was capable and fair, according to a lot of people. So you have these rumblings happening where people are thinking, are we better off under someone who isn't Henry VI, and maybe Richard, Duke of York is our guy. Now, at the same time, what's happening with these women, you have Margaret of Anjou, who's married to Henry VI. You have Cecily Neville, who's married to Richard, Duke of York, and they're friends. And it's just difficult, as it would be when your husbands are kind of at each other's throats, as much as Henry VI could ever be at anyone's throat. But Richard, Duke of York, is certainly kind of, he's there. He's in the shadows. He's kind of waiting in the wings to find, his moment to seize some power, likely not to become king, but to at least enhance his own influence. And you have Cecily trying desperately to maintain a relationship with Margaret of Anjou. The two of them, had a long friendship. Jaquetta of Luxembourg is obviously close to Margaret of Anjou throughout her adulthood until, of course, she can't be anymore because her alliance also has to shift. But she's there, comforting Margaret of Anjou. You have Cecily on the other side of things, trying desperately to maintain a relationship with Margaret of Anjou, even when she was put in a really bad position. And you have these three really incredible women and incredibly strong personalities coexisting at the English court at a time when they should not have been able to maintain a relationship. Jaquetta and Margaret, sure, they were very much on the same team still at that point in time. But Cecily, found herself in a really difficult position. But we do have evidence that Cecily was still trying to maintain that relationship. It could have been, easy for her to have kind of walked away, from that relationship at court, and to have just completely thrown her hat into the ring of the Yorkist camp, which we know she ended up having to do whenever her husband, was kind of propped up as an alternate king. But during the earlier years, Cecily she was trying to pull on these friendship networks that she had established, especially with Margaret of Anjou, and she was, trying to find a middle ground there. Now, we of course know that middle ground was not able to be found because when Henry VI, fell into his catatonic state, too many people got a glimpse of what life could be like under someone who wasn't Henry VI. And, unfortunately for him and for Margaret of Anjou, I think once that cat was sort of out of the bag, it was impossible to return to normalcy under Henry VI when people were aware of how differently the country could be run. Neville's and York's being at the top of the list of those discontent nobles. But when you think of someone like Cecily Neville, who was born into a Lancastrian family, I mean, she was part of the royal house of Lancaster. Her loyalty had been so staunchly Lancastrian, and the same for Jaquetta of Luxembourg. She was staunchly Lancastrian. She married directly into the Lancastrian family. So these two women were such strong supporters of the House of Lancaster, and then both of them, due to outside circumstances, both of them had to end up shifting their loyalty to the House of York. They didn't have any choice in the matter but to leave Margaret of Anjou behind. She certainly emerges from the Wars of the Roses as someone who survived on paper, but, really lost the Wars of the Roses. But you have Cecily and Jaquetta both shifting their allegiance to the House of York, and they both, become ultimate survivors of this really complicated time period. Jaquetta, even in the face of witchcraft accusations, which at the time was something that could be very dangerous to women, especially, members of the royal family or the upper levels of nobility. So, they worked with what they had at their disposal to ensure not only their own survival, but also the forward movement of their own families, and in Cecily's case, her family's claim to the throne. Now, her husband obviously, never ended up being able to wear the crown himself, but Cecily's son takes over as Edward IV, and Cecily is kind of seen as, sort of like a queen by right type of thing, because her husband, according to some people's belief, certainly should have been king himself. So Cecily, she even ascends to the highest almost level of power at the English court. Of course, her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, Jaquetta of Luxembourg's daughter, does ascend to that, the absolute pinnacle of power when she becomes the first Yorkist queen. So you have these women who, they are, in my opinion, as important of historical figures to learn about as the men that they were, living alongside and oftentimes married to or mothers of. But, we don't give them the same sort of weight often when we're talking about the Wars of the Roses, or at least we didn't until, the last generation or two of historians really started to look at these women as political actors in their own right, and have started to slowly chip away, at the sort of like the cloud that has just existed around women's history at this time period, where it's like a fog, like you can almost make out the woman, but you just can't quite track her movements in the same way that you can the men around her. But I think when we look at these friendship networks, we look at a lot of examples of overlapping time spent at court, or when these women were visiting each other's homes, or when they were writing letters to one another, or when a third party was writing letters about these women, working together toward a common goal. I think they start just to kind of come into clearer relief. We start to understand them better and how they were working within, I guess, what we could term maybe like social avenues of power. These women, besides Margaret of Anjou, weren't on the battlefield, but they were, kind of like massaging these relationships. They were trying to further the best interest of their own family and personal connections through these personal relationships that they had with one another.
I just love this topic so much. And like I mentioned previously, today we're talking about Elizabeth
Mhm.
Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. And now you just set it up so perfectly because I feel like I want to start with Elizabeth Woodville and I want to
Yes.
look at how much her life and her choices were influenced maybe by her mother and the other two women. Like, what do we
Yeah.
see?
Yeah, so Elizabeth, she's such a fascinating case study because we do have more information on Elizabeth than we do on her mother, Jaquetta, and more information than we do on her eventual mother-in-law, Cecily Neville, who we think likely Elizabeth's relationship with those two women looked very different. So we know Elizabeth was really close with Jaquetta. The Woodvilles were sort of famous for having a very close knit family structure. So Jaquetta and her husband Richard Woodville had several children, and they all seem to have maintained a close relationship. The children with their parents, but also their children with their siblings. That we think that the Woodville family unit would have been very close for the duration. We know that often when you find Elizabeth in the sources when she becomes queen, you also find Jaquetta. Jaquetta just seems to have consistently been by her daughter's side. One thing that I think Jaquetta likely would have done with Elizabeth, and again, it's not spelled out in the sources, which is difficult, when you're trying to say anything definitively. But I think it's not much of a stretch to say that Jaquetta would have prepared Elizabeth for operating as an adult within a really tense political climate. So Jaquetta had spent all of her adult years trying to navigate the complexities of the English court. We do think that Elizabeth was likely alongside Jaquetta often at court. We think it's likely that she would have served in Margaret of Anjou's household. Again, the sources are a little complicated to say, with 100% certainty that Elizabeth would have served at Margaret's in Margaret's household, but we know that Jaquetta was often at court with Margaret, and we would assume, based on how these things tended to operate, that Elizabeth would have benefited from her mother's close relationship with the Queen by, her also being placed in the Queen's household, just to try and strengthen, future prospects for Elizabeth as being the oldest daughter and child of Jaquetta and Richard. So I do think, Margaret of Anjou would have had an impact on Elizabeth that would have likely informed Elizabeth a bit of what good and problematic queenship would have looked like. Because certainly, Margaret of Anjou, even prior to really the start of the Wars of the Roses, she still had her critics at court. She wasn't a universally popular queen, not just because of certain aspects that were out of her control, like being a foreigner when it wasn't terribly popular with a lot of people at court to have a relationship with the French, but also Margaret, she spent a lot of money, which was something that was met with a lot of criticism at the time. And that's something that when Elizabeth becomes queen, really interestingly, we see her being very mindful of her own finances and spending far less than Margaret of Anjou had spent. And I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to say that Elizabeth may have learned from Margaret's behavior and gone out of her way to kind of do the opposite when she herself became queen because she saw, that there was some criticism there. And certainly Jaquetta would have been able to have given Elizabeth insight into criticism of Margaret of Anjou because she was constantly by Margaret of Anjou's side and knew very well the criticisms that Margaret had faced at court because Jaquetta was very plugged in at court. The Woodvilles, one thing about the Woodvilles that I would like to retire, if I may, is this idea that they were plucked from obscurity. They came from nowhere. Elizabeth Woodville just happened to be really pretty, but no one knew who she was. She was a complete unknown, when Edward IV met her underneath that tree with her sons. That wasn't the case. Elizabeth Woodville came from a family that was immensely powerful, immensely well connected at the court of Henry VI. I would argue one of the most powerful families, kind of in opposition, possibly, to Cecily Neville and the Duke of York. You know, these two duchesses. You have Jaquetta and Cecily, who are both incredibly influential in England, and they're, both exact contemporaries, both born in 1415, both really strong personalities, but from what we can tell, likely very different personalities. And we think, that's something that Elizabeth Woodville had to contend with when Cecily Neville became her mother-in-law. Now, we don't have sources that spell out explicitly that Cecily and Elizabeth had a difficult relationship, but whereas Elizabeth had a very warm and loving relationship with her own mother, Jaquetta, which you might expect, her relationship with Cecily does not seem to have been quite so warm and loving. Not saying that she's the mother-in-law from, am I allowed to say hell?
Yes.
Is it? Okay. Not saying that she was the mother-in-law from hell, because that's something, that's a narrative that we also get with Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York that, likely is a later invention, the extreme nature of that relationship. And I think it's likely similar for Cecily and Elizabeth that this negative relationship between the two of them might be something that has kind of snowballed a bit in modern understandings. But I think even at the time, you can kind of see in some sources that maybe the two of them weren't incredibly close. Certainly, Cecily thought that her son, Edward IV, should have married a foreign princess and not a woman from his own realm. But I don't think that that's necessarily a shot to Elizabeth as an individual. But it could be just because we know that there was a tense relationship between the Nevilles, so Cecily's family, and the Woodvilles, Elizabeth's family. That tense relationship really comes to light a lot more with the men. So we know that many of the men who were attached to Cecily Neville, so her brother, her nephew, and even Edward IV himself, they did not like Richard Woodville during Henry VI's reign. And that's something that's backed up, in several different sources, both during the Lancastrian reign and the Yorkist reign. We know there was a really tense relationship there, but Elizabeth and Cecily did have to coexist, and they did coexist. They coexisted well enough, I think, because Edward IV made sure that they did. We do know that he built separate lodgings for Elizabeth when she became his queen, because he didn't want to kick his mother out of the queen's lodgings, which is interesting. I think another good example of how Edward IV was really trying to be a peacekeeper in a lot of different relationships in his life, not just between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, but, I think he was playing kind of a peacekeeper role between his wife and his mother also. But that's not to say that Elizabeth wouldn't have also learned from Cecily and benefited from that relationship. We just, again, don't have that, spelled out for us. We don't have much personal insight into the relationship between the two of them. We can't quite track their movements on like an individual level in the same way that we can with Elizabeth and Jaquetta. Like we know when Elizabeth found herself in a dangerous position, which happened to her several times throughout her life, she always ran to Jaquetta. She always either ran to her mother or her mother ran to her. The two of them, anytime, Elizabeth was in any real danger, Jaquetta was there. And then once Jaquetta passed away, anytime Elizabeth was in real danger, she was with her daughters, especially Elizabeth of York, who would have been old enough to have understood some political maneuverings herself. So, I think it's interesting. I think Elizabeth Woodville gives us some really neat insight into women's relationships, just because she had really complicated relationships with a lot of women at the time. Maybe no more so than Margaret Beaufort, who I know is the other woman who we're going to be talking about today, and they weren't related. So,
Yeah.
that gives us some interesting insight into possibilities for women's friendship, which, I think is also a really interesting avenue of research that's kind of starting to pick up steam a little bit in medieval circles.
Yeah, it's interesting to me when we look at Elizabeth Woodville, we see her connection to these powerful women, including
Hmm.
her mother and Cecily, and obviously seeing Margaret of Anjou as well and knowing how she behaved toward things. And then when we look at Margaret Beaufort, I feel like I don't see those strong
Yeah.
female, I mean, unless you count Margaret of Anjou, but other than that, it's not like we know that she had a strong relationship with her mother and her mother was teaching these.
Hmm.
So where did she learn how to network?
Yeah. So Margaret Beaufort's story is a difficult one for a lot of reasons that she experienced personally. So whereas, Elizabeth Woodville was born into a very close-knit, loving family that were kind of like a consistent source of safety and happiness, for her, from what we can tell, throughout, her parents' lives. Ultimately, she does pay several different times with the lives of her family members, which, had to have been very difficult. But with Margaret Beaufort, it's kind of the opposite. She's born sort of like she's kind of like on an island for a lot of her life. She doesn't have these close relationships. We know she did. She had a relationship with her mother. It's impossible to tell, kind of how close that relationship would have been because her mother was really limited in having any sort of control over Margaret's life. Margaret was seen as being, it sounds bad to say, but maybe like a tool for the royal family. She obviously ended up marrying one of Henry VI's half-brothers, and that was done in an attempt to kind of shore up his power. Margaret was incredibly wealthy because her father passed away, possibly self-inflicted when she was just a baby. And so she inherited just a massive amount of wealth and lands and power as a young child. And she kind of became like a pawn of the royal family. A lot of people were vying for her hand in marriage from the time she was a child. And obviously, when she ends up marrying Edmund Tudor, it's done to try and secure his place in English society, but also with the possibility that a child that the two of them might have could possibly be a claimant to the Lancastrian throne, which we know does end up happening with Henry Tudor. But even with Edmund Tudor, I mean, Margaret is barely married to him before he is, whisked away, trying to navigate again this really tumultuous time period of the Wars of the Roses, and he dies. And she's widowed and she's pregnant and she's 13 years old when she gives birth. Again, kind of alone. She has her brother-in-law. She has, Jasper Tudor there to kind of serve as a protector for her. But again, she's alone. It then becomes her and her baby. She, I think, really anything, in my opinion, in Margaret Beaufort's life revolves around her son. I think her entire career after she had Henry Tudor, I think, was dedicated to protecting her son, protecting his interests, furthering his interest, not to become king. I don't think that had entered into anyone's mind that he would be a viable candidate for king after Edward IV took the throne. But, he understandably does have to leave England because he is seen as being a threat from the House of Lancaster. And just for his own safety and also, for kind of the safety of the people around him, it makes sense for him to go to France. And then we see Margaret, she kind of shifts her focus. She's trying to again benefit her son, but she wants to bring him back. She wants to bring him home to England. So she becomes sort of like it feels almost like tunnel vision, where everything she does from that moment on is not just self-preservation, which she did from a young age. She had to learn self-preservation. She really was a master of self-preservation. But it was also to try and find a way to bring this son back to England in a way that he wouldn't be a threat to Edward IV. And so this is when we see Margaret at the Yorkist court. She seems very friendly with Elizabeth Woodville. We don't have insight into a relationship that Margaret and Elizabeth would have had prior to when Elizabeth became queen. I think it makes sense to assume that the two of them may have crossed paths at different moments in their younger lives. They were pretty close in age, but we don't have evidence of the two of them having any sort of relationship when they were both loyal Lancastrians under Henry VI. It's one of those, there are a lot of those kinds of moments in the history of the Wars of the Roses where that these individuals would have overlapped and often had the same allegiances and alliances, but we just don't have the primary source base to shed any light on what a relationship between these two women may have looked like until Elizabeth becomes queen. And then when Elizabeth becomes queen, Margaret is pretty consistently at these really important royal ceremonies. She is at, different events where Elizabeth and Edward are presiding over their court. And you have Margaret Beaufort right there from just looking at her, you would think that she was certainly fine with a Yorkist rule. We know about Margaret that she wasn't. She, did very much maintain those loyalties to the House of Lancaster, and I don't think, people would have blamed her for that. But she was really smart that she kept those loyalties hidden. And it looks like she and Elizabeth had, if not a friendship in like a modern sense, they at least had a good working relationship. The two of them, we see them overlapping a lot. Margaret was not treated, like any sort of social outcast for being a member of the House of Beaufort, which obviously had
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
This episode is brought to you by Fox One. Watch all 104 matches of the FIFA World Cup live in 4K for just $19.99 a month with 3 days free. Build your own multi-view, choose up to 3 streams, and follow player spotlights. Stay on top of every moment with live stats, highlights, and instant replays. The FIFA World Cup, streaming live on Fox One. Offers are subject to change. See fox.com for complete terms and conditions.
Strict Lancastrian alliances, she seems to have been kind of just brought into the royal court, probably as part of Edward IV's efforts to enhance some relationships between Lancastrians and Yorkists. Margaret seems like she, fit the bill with that. She was pretty regularly at the side of the royal family until Edward IV is famously deposed. Henry VI is brought back in the readoption, and then Margaret's there too. She's at Henry VI court. So Margaret, she kind of keeps popping up. I would assume that she was probably much happier to be at Henry VI court because, again, she was a Lancastrian. She certainly would have wanted a Lancastrian head to be the one wearing the crown. But again, when Henry VI is once again deposed, poor guy, and then he mysteriously dies from being super sad in the Tower, and Edward IV is brought back again for the second half of his kingship, there's Margaret. Margaret's there again.
Right.
She's back, and she, is back by Elizabeth Woodville's side, and from what we can tell, again, has a decent relationship with the royal family. Now, I think it would make sense to think that Elizabeth Woodville likely didn't view Margaret Beaufort maybe in the same way that she would have viewed some of her sisters-in-law. For example, we know she had a good relationship with Margaret of York, and I think she likely would have trusted Margaret of York. I doubt if she trusted Margaret Beaufort. to that same extent because, she would have seen that she was shifting these alliances, but Elizabeth Woodville herself shifted alliances. So it was very common at the time for people because they were so concerned with self-preservation. And again, Margaret, always had that end goal of having her son returned to her, again, not as king, but as Earl of Richmond, which was his rightful title.
Yeah.
I think she was doing anything she could to try and ensure that that could happen. And I think that was understandable. And I think we can see that Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville were very maybe not happy, but they were very amenable to the idea that people did have these really complicated allegiances. And I think that really shines through with Edward and his reluctance to do away with Clarence. George, Duke of Clarence, did many things that could have been considered treasonable offenses.
Yeah.
You do have the really complicated layer added onto that they were brothers. No one, really wants to have to make that call about their own flesh and blood. But, Edward did, I think, everything he could to try and make that work. And if he would do that, for Clarence and for the Kingmaker and these people who very much, posed a real threat to him, I don't think it's surprising that they brought Margaret Beaufort back to court and that all seemed to be, forgiven, at least from an outsider's perspective. It doesn't seem like there was any sort of difficult relationship between Elizabeth and Margaret in the real historical sources. I know that's something that people do assume. I think Margaret Beaufort, unfortunately, emerges in some of the modern mindset as being like a bad guy. She's a villain, and people think that that she was, hated and mistrusted at court, and that doesn't seem to bear out in the real sources, from what we can tell. She had too many instances where she was shown like great honor and favor by Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV to think that she was seen as being any sort of like a villainous figure, at the Yorkist court. I think it was understandable that her allegiances were complicated.
Well,
you can't blame her.
No, I was just going to say, you just built up the whole Margaret Beaufort as the villain. We have to talk about the Princes in the Tower, obviously, because she so frequently is painted as the villain in this, that she is responsible. Where does the truth lie in this?
So the truth, and this might not be super popular with some listeners, so I'll apologize in advance and I'll deliver it as gently as I can. But the truth with that storyline is that it's completely fictional. There's no universe where Margaret Beaufort would have killed the princes in the tower, even though that's, it makes a great story. As someone who's really interested in women's history, trust me, like it's very tempting to think, could she have done that? But it's just not, it makes a great modern fictional retelling, but just based in the actual historical sources and who Margaret was as a person and these different relationships that she had, not least of which being with the Princess in the Tower's mother, Elizabeth Woodville. There's not, first of all, there's not the physical access to the princes to even be able to kill them. So Margaret, would not have been able to have gotten in the Tower of London, removed the princes, and had them murdered under Richard III's reign. But also, just on a very personal level, Margaret, from what we can tell about her actual personality, the real person that was living through this really dangerous time period, it wouldn't have jived with Margaret's religious convictions to have killed two small boys, and it also would not. It doesn't work with her friendship with Elizabeth Woodville, or even if you're not comfortable calling it a friendship, it wouldn't have worked with her relationship with Elizabeth Woodville. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind that killing the princes in the Tower during Richard III's reign really wouldn't have moved Henry Tudor closer to England. If anything, Henry Tudor then poses a bigger threat because Richard III would be really dumb to bring Henry Tudor back when he then would be arguably one of the biggest threats to Richard III's hold on the crown. And Richard III was not a dumb man. He was very plugged in politically. He knew the ins and outs of allegiances and, the royal court better than almost anyone else. And he, would not have brought Henry Tudor back into the mix because Henry Tudor's mother killed the princes in the Tower. It doesn't.
Yeah.
The line of reasoning, it's really interesting, and it does make for an interesting alternative theory to the traditional narrative of Richard III being, responsible for the princes in the Tower. But I think there are many more likely alternative theories than Margaret Beaufort being responsible. I would see the Margaret Beaufort argument as being something that does make for interesting historical fiction, but just it's not based in the sources. Actually, I would argue, and again, this is something that I always like to be sensitive, talking about these kinds of things, just because the source survival from the period of the princes in the Tower, the source survival is complicated. The sources that we have surviving to us are not, it's not the full source base, which it's never going to be for the medieval period. But even the sources that we do have surviving to us from the year 1483 to 1485, 1487, they're complicated. The nature of those sources are complicated because sometimes we might think that we know a history, but it might be a very particular portrayal of that history. So I'm thinking of like Dominic Mancini's Chronicle, for instance. So much of what we think we know about this time period comes from that chronicle, but it's been discussed that maybe we shouldn't view that particular source as being 100% unbiased and 100% accurate. And I think that's smart. I think it's smart to kind of tread carefully when you're, talking about the princes in the Tower. It's one of the reasons why I don't think this particular mystery will ever be solved. But it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And I've spent a lot of time thinking particularly about the women surrounding the mystery of the princes in the Tower, because I think that's often an angle that is understudied or underanalyzed. I think so you can so easily get caught up in Richard III and the Duke of Buckingham and the Duke of Norfolk and, these really interesting men, and Henry Tudor, these really interesting men who certainly had a lot to gain or lose at that time period. And you can find yourself kind of getting lost in endless discussions of did they or didn't they, especially with Richard III. I think where maybe a fuller understanding of the complexities surrounding the princes in the Tower might lie is when you do look at the women who also played very prominent roles at the time in this story, but whose roles in this disappearance, might have been lost to time through, frankly, historians kind of ignoring the women who were close to these boys, none more so than Elizabeth Woodville, their mother. That's really what most people know about Elizabeth Woodville. If you know Elizabeth Woodville, you likely know that she was the mother of the princes in the Tower, and then that's kind of it. A lot of people like to think that she was sort of an inactive political character, that her sons were put in the Tower and she, for all intents and purposes, just kind of gave up and threw her hands up and just lived in sanctuary and didn't know what ended up happening to her sons. And it removes any sort of agency that she may have had. And instead, a popular modern narrative puts a lot of agency in Margaret Beaufort's hands, thinking that she can break into the Tower and kill these boys to try and pave the way for Richard III ultimately also dying, and then her son coming over and taking over as king. What I think is really interesting when you are thinking about the princes in the tower is the roles that these two women in particular may have played on the ground in England in 1483 when these princes are, we know they're alive, we know they're in the tower, and we know that people on the ground were likely operating to try and get these boys out of the tower. And again, this is where the sources, you do have to issue kind of like a blanket statement. There is a later source written in the mid 16th century, so a couple decades after the events are taking place that we're concerned with when we talk about the princes in the tower. This later source, it was written by John Stowe. He's an antiquarian, and he, chronicled these really important events that happened during the Wars of the Roses time period. And he claims that in July of 1483, so this is right after Richard III is crowned king, he claims that when Richard leaves on progress, newly crowned, that there are people on the streets of London who are working to try and rescue the princes from the tower. They think that if they set fires around the city while people are distracted trying to put out these fires, they will work with an insider in the Tower of London, someone who worked in the Tower of London who was plotting with these rebels to rescue the boys from the tower and eventually, likely do away with Richard III and then crown Prince Edward as Edward V. Now, some historians have thought that John Stowe completely made this up, that these plots didn't happen. There was no, July plotting. There weren't fires around London. No one was trying to rescue these boys because it was recorded in a much later source, which in and of itself is problematic because we take the later source of Thomas More as giving us, some really useful insights.
Yeah.
But then, someone writing not long after Thomas More is considered problematic because he's writing so long after the fact. But if you put, that argument to the side, and instead you're just looking at John Stowe's chronicle and saying, is it reliable? Were these fires actually happening? I think you can argue that likely they were because we did end up finding a source written on the continent in 1484 that talks about similar rebellions and plotting happening in the summer of 1483 in London in an attempt, again, to save the princes from the tower. So I think it's, likely that this plotting did happen on the ground. So this would be when the princes were in the tower, when Elizabeth Woodville is in London in sanctuary, and Richard III is away on progress. So he's a couple days ride away from the city of London. What's really interesting to me is that we know that a relative, a very close relative, actually a half-brother of Margaret Beaufort, was involved in some sort of plotting to overthrow Richard III in the summer of 1483. We also know that this is the first time when Henry Tudor, who is still over on the continent in safety, where he's mentioned as having taken place in plotting, again, to overthrow Richard III and likely to restore the princes in the tower. So when we start to, again, take these puzzle pieces and kind of put them together, we know that the princes are alive in the Tower of London. Elizabeth Woodville is in sanctuary. Again, Richard III is out of the picture for the time being. You have Henry Tudor, who's somehow involved in this scheming happening in London, and you have Margaret Beaufort's half-brother, who goes on to be arrested, or they're searching him out to arrest him, but he has fled to the continent to join Henry Tudor. So he's not caught for this scheming. What I think is really interesting is that we know that a couple months later, Elizabeth Woodville in sanctuary and Margaret Beaufort start similarly plotting through their shared doctor.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man, an 8-episode series, now streaming on Disney+.
A superhero remake, not exactly what we'd expect from an Oscar-winning director.
Action! Simon Williams, audition for Wonder Man.
I'm gonna need you to sign this, assuming you don't have superpowers.
I'll never work again if anyone found out.
My lips are sealed.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man. All 8 episodes now streaming, only on Disney+.
I would be really interested to know if that plotting between the two of them wasn't also happening in the summer of 1483. If it wasn't from the time that these boys are lodged in the Tower and Richard III becomes king, that Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville weren't already immediately working together, which I think answers a lot of questions that historians have had with Elizabeth Woodville's movements. And from what I think we know, and I think I know Elizabeth Woodville as well as you can know a medieval woman, she doesn't seem the type to have just been completely hands off and to have given up. I think she had overcome a lot of obstacles throughout her life up to that point. I think likely she had done everything she could to try and get Edward V crowned as quickly as possible to try and limit any power that Gloucester, who would become Richard III, might end up having during a protectorship for Edward V. I think she would have certainly not given her youngest son, Prince Richard, into the hands of Richard III, and then just completely thrown her hands in the air and said, "Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
I'm safe in sanctuary with my daughters. Whatever happens to my sons happens." I don't see that being the case. I also don't see Margaret Beaufort being content with a Richard III monarchy if there was a chance that Edward V instead could be crowned. Because Margaret, again, would have been smart enough to have known that if Richard III, even though, it seemed like the two of them had a decent working relationship. I mean, she featured in his coronation, and her husband, Thomas Stanley, was actually, we think, on progress with Richard III when these fires were being set around London. But, it wouldn't be the first time that Margaret Beaufort kept her options open. And I think to her, it would have made more sense that her son could have come back under an Edward V kingship versus a Richard III kingship. Again, like I said, a couple minutes ago, Richard III was not going to bring Henry Tudor back to England in at least the first couple years of him being king, because his hold on the crown was already, maybe not questionable. That might not be the best word, but his hold he didn't have a very tight grip on the crown in the early years of his kingship. He certainly wasn't going to bring Henry Tudor back if Henry Tudor was already enough of a threat to Edward IV to have not been brought back. Who Henry Tudor would not have been as much of a threat to is Edward V, not just because Edward V would have had not as much pushback becoming king as Richard III, because at the time, everyone expected Edward V to become king after Edward IV died. I mean, he was king in training. He likely would have been, I think, a pretty decent king based on what we know about the training that he had in Ludlow. And I think, anyone would have, at the time, not been disappointed to have had Edward V become king. They might not have liked the Woodville control, but, he wouldn't have been up against the same type of threats to his crown as Richard III was. So I think it answers a lot of questions about what these women could have been doing, who could have been, active during the early weeks of Richard III's reign to try and figure out a way to get these boys out of the Tower, to have Edward crowned as Edward V, and then to do away with Richard much sooner than Bosworth Field. We know that these women ended up orchestrating a marriage between their children, Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York later, to bring about an end to Richard III. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to think that scheming between these two women may have started as early as Richard III's coronation or soon after, which is just such like I spend a lot of time thinking about, these months of spring and summer of 1483, because I too have been sucked into the Princes in the Tower mystery that, I think about them all the time. But I think about them from the women's point of view. Obviously, Richard III is such a fascinating historical character who I think has suffered, like Margaret Beaufort, some like real character assassination in the years since. So I do find him incredibly interesting, and Buckingham I don't like as much. But he's still interesting to learn about. These men, certainly you need to take into consideration their own motivations, their own movements, but I think we owe the women that same type of consideration. I think we are doing a disservice to these women and also to the time period to think that they weren't doing anything, to think that they were just sitting at home hoping for the best, when we know that that's not what women were doing during the Wars of the Roses time period. And I think I think we would just have a much fuller and richer understanding if we continue to work to uncover these women's stories and to search for, search the archives for these women's stories to try and see what they may have been doing at that time instead of accepting the traditional narrative that they weren't doing anything.
Yeah. I love this idea. I had never heard of that plot before. And I
Yeah.
love the idea of picturing, well, I mean, I don't love the idea of picturing her, but of Elizabeth Woodville being in sanctuary,
Mhm.
unable to do things outside of sanctuary, but using people
Yeah.
to help, and Margaret Beaufort being outside, possibly helping to plot this
Yeah.
rescue of her friends, two
Hmm.
sons. But in the end, it would also benefit Margaret because then she
Yes.
could bring her son home and he could probably be reinstated as Earl of Richmond as
And
well,
that's what
right?
she wanted. That's what we have the benefit of hindsight, which in some ways is great. Like it's nice, that we know how this stuff ends. But in other ways, it can be dangerous to base what we think we know about these people off of how their story ends. And I think with Margaret Beaufort, it's dangerous because we know that her son ends up becoming king, so it's easy to read back on everything that she did throughout her life to try and get her son to wear the crown. And that just doesn't bear out in the historical sources. Of course, it does once that becomes a viable option for her and Elizabeth Woodville to marry their children. And then it's that's obvious. It's obvious that Margaret is fighting for her son to come over and to be crowned as king. But up until that point, and certainly in 1483, I mean, she had just, Edward the Fourth's death was really unexpected. And Margaret had been operating at court very, very close to reaching an agreement with Edward IV that Elizabeth Woodville, likely was kind of helping to facilitate. But Margaret Beaufort was very close to reaching an agreement with Edward IV to bring her son back. And then, of course, he dies. And that throws the entire country's turned upside down. Everything is thrown back into turmoil. And, depending sort of on what side your own opinion lies. Either Richard III again takes over because he always secretly wanted to be king, which I do not think is also historically accurate, or he takes over because he doesn't have another choice because the children of Elizabeth Woodville have been declared illegitimate, and in the eyes of the English people, they are illegitimate. And if Richard III doesn't take over as king, then the country is thrown right back into the Wars of the Roses. Which, of course, from hindsight, we know that the Wars of the Roses was still ongoing during Richard III's reign. But from Richard's point of view and the point of view of his allies, he was continuing on the rule of the House of York, and they likely knew that there would be some threats to his throne, but still likely did not think that Henry Tudor would come over and
Right.
somehow manage to wear the crown. It wasn't a likely scenario yet in 1483. I think the much more likely scenario is that Londoners and people that we know were closely associated with Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville were trying to get the boys out of the Tower to reinstate Edward V so he could finally have that coronation. And again, to do that, you have to neutralize Richard III one way or the other. So I don't think the intention behind those plotters was to have a very pleasant ending for Richard III, but I think their end goal was Edward V. And
Mm.
I don't think it's unlikely that Elizabeth Woodville would have known about that plot, and that maybe even some of her family members and certainly her allies would have taken part in that plot. And it is almost a certainty. You can't really say much is a certainty with this time period, but it's almost a certainty that Margaret Beaufort's half-brother was, in fact, working towards rebelling against Richard III at this time. So it's very intriguing to think that these two women may have had a role to play that early on. It just wasn't successful. So we don't know what role they did play because the plotters obviously didn't rescue the princes.
Yeah, and from there, the rest was history, wasn't
Mhm.
it? I like
History, but still a mystery.
Yeah, I know.
I still want to know what happened.
We
But maybe
all
we're
do.
one step closer.
I like the idea of Elizabeth Woodville almost like repaying her friend Margaret for, the possible attempt to remove her sons by saying, I want to be a fly on the wall, and I like hear a conversation or see letters where they're talking about, like, thank you so much for everything that you've done trying to reinstate my son. And as a thank you, I want to marry your son to my daughter.
Yeah. And we know, I mean, the two of them, those two women were absolute powerhouses themselves. Like they were both complete forces to be reckoned with. But I do think they don't get enough credit for the role, the really integral role that the two of them played in bringing about an end to the Wars of the Roses. I think Henry Tudor gets the credit because of his victory on the battlefield at Bosworth. But the reason why Henry Tudor was even a viable option to wear the crown after Richard III is because of the work that his mother and his future mother-in-law were doing on the ground in England. And I love, I am a medieval woman fan. That's my time period. These are my women that I really, I just think they're so fascinating and there's so much to learn from them. But I love the fact that the Wars of the Roses, this really just heartbreaking, devastating, dangerous, tumultuous time period, was brought to an end after generations of bloodshed and infighting, was brought to an end by the planning of two women. And I love that. And I think they don't get enough credit for the role that they played in bringing about an end to this series of civil wars that just absolutely devastated England for decades. And they somehow managed to finally, bring these two houses together, and of course create the Tudor dynasty. For better or for worse, they created the Tudor dynasty. Depends on who you ask, but it's impossible to not admire them for that and to really respect what the two of them were able to pull off. Of course, with Henry Tudor and his help, but really they were the ones on the ground paving the way for him to be able to come over, which I think is just such a testament to two women who I see as being, kind of like ultimate survivors.
For sure. And I can't help but notice this whole time you've been talking over your shoulder, Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV have been looking at me.
They're back there, Edward. And that is Elizabeth. I need to move her a little bit so that you can see her a little bit better. But Edward, you can see really well. I'd like to have him sitting over, my shoulder. One of my historical hills to die on is not just to have more attention paid to medieval women, which obviously, is my life goal. But another life goal is to get some respect for Edward IV and some interest for Edward IV. He was such an incredible king. I mean, really, he achieved so much in such little time in really complicated circumstances.
Yes.
And I like to give an Edward IV plug whenever I can, because I wish he was undefeated on the field of battle, brought together two warring houses. And that's the only reason why the Wars of the Roses had as long of a pause as it did, is because of Edward IV's personality. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone else in that time period who could have effectively ruled after deposing Henry VI. I wouldn't imagine that the Duke of York would have had as easy of a time kind of uniting the country under him. And if it wasn't for that pesky, I feel like a Scooby-Doo episode, if it wasn't for that pesky kingmaker, Edward would have had a pretty seamless reign until his unfortunate early death. But if you ever want to do a future episode on Edward IV, let me know, because it's another goal of mine. I really would like for him to achieve a similar hero status to Henry V. I think it's deserved.
Yes, it is. And
not...
on my journey with Matt Lewis through the medieval monarchs, we're getting closer to Edward IV. So I'll be interested to see what he has to say. And then I'll have to have you back to see your point of view.
Well, I think it's probably safe to say that Matt likely has a favorable opinion of Edward IV, because we know Matt is a Duke of York guy and a Richard III guy. And Richard III, the whole, everything we think we know about Richard III during his brother's reign is that he was nothing but a loyal and trustworthy ally and advisor to Edward IV, which really flies in the face of the Richard III who has survived to us through modern understandings and retellings of him as an individual. So I'll be really interested to hear what Matt says, because when you look at Edward IV's reign, one of the reasons why he was able to be so successful is because of Richard. He needed someone who he could trust unconditionally.
Not George.
And unconditional trust at that time, that is hard to come by. Ask Elizabeth and Margaret. It was hard to find someone who was that undyingly loyal. But we do, it seems like we have that kind of a relationship between Edward and Richard. So I'll be listening for that episode for sure. And if Matt says a bunch of mean things about Edward IV, telling me he's going to have to answer to me, we'll have all three of us on an episode, Rebecca, and you can moderate.
Oh, I would love that so much. Well, Lacey, before we go, I want to give you the opportunity and listeners the opportunity to know that if they had listened to this episode or the previous one and they have questions or comments, maybe they want to throw stuff at you.
Oh, please. I run a Substack called The Historian's Desk, and that's where I spend most of my time. So I'm pretty active over there. We have a great group of similarly interested individuals, mostly in the late medieval, early modern time period. And we have a lot of really great discussions on Substack. And I run some virtual courses and some book clubs, and we meet to talk as a group on Zoom. So if this is your jam, you will find a community of similarly interested individuals over on my Substack. So that's where I spend most of my time. But you can also find me on other social media. So I'm on Instagram, just kind of all the things as Lacey Bonar Hull _historian. I think that's what I am on all of them. And I told you after the last episode, Rebecca, I said I'm gonna memorize my social media handles, and I haven't. But I do. I mean, my time is on Substack, and then my other little bit of social media time is on Instagram. So I would say those are your two most likely places. And it is The Historian's Desk on Substack, Lacey Bonar Hull _historian on Instagram.
And I will include links in the show notes so that people can easily find. I'll double check. I'm pretty sure you're right with your handle.
I spend too much time thinking about Elizabeth and Edward and not enough time thinking about what I'm going to be posting. And most of my posts, unsurprisingly, are about the Wars of the Roses time period.
Yeah. I love the stuff that you post, and it's so popular. So if you guys aren't following her yet on Substack, be sure to. Well,
I appreciate that.
Dr. Lacey Bonar Hull, thank you so much for coming back for part 2. This was so great.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. I can't wait to see what we talk about next time. I'll talk medieval women with you any day. You just let me know when.
Oh, I'm going to hold you to that.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. This podcast would not be possible without the wonderful support of my generous Patreon patrons. If you'd like to become a patron, you get commercial-free episodes, early access, and exclusive content. Head over to Patreon, that's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty for more information. Until next.
Tires matter. They're the only part of your vehicle that touches the road. Tread confidently with new tires from Tire Rack. Whether you're looking for expert recommendations or know exactly what you want, Tire Rack makes it easy. Fast, free shipping, free road hazard protection, and convenient installation options. Go to TireRack.com to see tire test results, tire ratings, and consumer reviews, and be sure to check out all the special offers. TireRack.com, the way tire buying should be.
Meet the new iSIMS, the single talent acquisition platform that's fully future-ready. It works wherever and however you hire, with insights no one else offers. One solution that fits seamlessly into your existing tech stack, which is why IT and HR leaders trust it. With the best of enterprise-grade software and AI, iSIMS helps you identify and secure the right talent faster. iSIMS, powering exceptional hiring. Learn more at isims.com.
Next time.